Welcome to the Common Weal Policy Podcast. This is episode number 85. I'm Jonathon, Shafi, and I'm delighted to be joined this week by Dr. Craig Dalzell. Craig, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing really good. It's been very busy over the past few weeks in Common Weal with the election and the fallout and everything coming together and working out exactly who wants what out of the next Parliament. But it's been an interesting time.
Yeah, and I've not been on the podcast for quite a while. I think the last time we talked was before the election, if I'm right.
Yeah.
And I have to say that I'm not so surprised at the outcome of the election. I'd kind of thought that would be the kind of pattern of seats and the kind of makeup of the Parliament that we've been left with. I was not surprised by that. Obviously, a very good election from the perspective of the SNP in many ways. The Greens have also gained a seat and are forming a serious presence within the Parliament. And I suppose that's our kind of jumping off point into this podcast. We're going to come a range of issues. But I wanted to sort of get your view, first of all, before we discuss potential Green SNP coalitions and agreements and so on. I wanted to discuss the speech that Nicola Sturgeon gave yesterday, which was the first 100 days of the Parliament and the priorities set out by the Scottish Government. I'll just start by asking you, was there anything that caught your eye which you were pleased with or that you thought there was potential around?
Yeah, so this speech is it really sets the tone for the Parliament. So a lot of it is on that symbolic first 100 days, the first 3 and a bit months of the Parliament, what they intend to start doing. It obviously deals with a lot of policies that will run right the way through the Parliament and potentially even longer for some of the more longer term plan stuff. But this is the stuff that they've deemed important enough to sort of get going right now. So it's always interesting to see what makes the list, what doesn't make the list, and maybe what's they could do better. Being a think tank that lobbies government, I do make a joke about it almost being my contractual obligation to say no matter what you do, you'd need to do better. But there is a serious point to that as well, in that there are areas of this government that we genuinely, sincerely think that they should go further on, and they don't meet the expectations of where we would go, based on our policy library and our research. So there were some interesting things in there. I was first thing on my list of notes that I drew up as the speech was going on was the mention of a Green Jobs Academy and a training scheme. We don't have many details about what this might mean, but it is potentially showing the understanding of just how big a transformation we're going to go through over the next couple of decades as we prepare for the Green New Deal, as we try to avert the climate emergency, which is becoming ever more present and intense in our lives. This is going to be a transformation that covers all aspects of the economy, and it's going to create a lot of new jobs, but it's going to change a lot of jobs as well. So people are going to need to be supported through that transition, whether they need to change the way they do their job or whether they need to change their job entirely. So having a structured strategy and plan for that transition is really important. The hint of a jobs academy suggests that this could be something that's formal, that's structured, and a core institution in Scotland, rather than perhaps, say, just a fund that sort of goes out into the world, and the vague promises of retraining that we've heard from previous governments. Whenever a major employer goes down in an area, you get the promise of workers will be supported as they retrain, and you never really hear much about it. So I'd be really interested to see the detail on that and how far that goes. Housing was a big one, and that is one where we do think that things must go further. The SNP were quite weak in their promises on housing through the election. There were hints at wanting to make housing more efficient, and the understanding that we do need to retrofit all of our existing housing to meet Green New Deal standards, but still we're not seeing even the rhetoric match what needs to go there. So what Common Weal have said is that from now, all new buildings, housing and otherwise, have to be built to Green New Deal standards. Because right now, that job of retrofitting our existing buildings up to those standards before 2045, that's probably the largest challenge that we have to face in the Green New Deal. And every single building we construct from now onwards that does not meet those standards is another building that will have to be retrofitted in the future, and this is contributing to that massive challenge of retrofitting. It should be a fairly simple change to just adjust building regulations to say, no, we cannot be building substandard buildings anymore. We know what the standards will be demanded of these buildings in less than 25 years, so let's do it right now and make the job of fixing everything else that little bit easier. So that's something that I really think should have been in that first 100 day, the upgrading of building regulations. It wasn't. I would like to see that revised.
There's one other area that kind of caught my eye. I mean, when you're listening to the First Minister talk about the first 100 days, obviously it's very well crafted. It sounds very progressive and very positive in terms of moving into this kind of pandemic recovery phase. But there is one issue in particular that I find needs to have more detail and more discussion around. And that is the offer of either a job, training or education to young people. And it just strikes me that there's a lot of that may well be unpaid. And youth unemployment in Scotland has grown by over 50% since the start of the pandemic. And it does slightly concern me, not slightly, it very much concerns me, that instead of just being resolute about jobs and getting people paid a decent wage, that there's lots of people going to fall through the net there. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into the things that I want to see come out of this Jobs Academy idea. Because again, we've seen those promises happen before where someone is offered training or offered a short-term position as a job, but then when they reach the end of that term, then they're basically just cast away because the focus is always on that offer of the first job, the first temporary training scheme. So what you end up with is just year after year, a new apprentice or a new trainee comes through, but they don't get a job at the end of it, and another new trainee comes through. So you get these people starting to build up a little bit of skill in a position, but they're not allowed to capitalise on it and turn it into a career because the focus is on getting the next trainee for that next first 12 months. There needs to be more support throughout that training scheme to get people not just trained up at the first instance, but embedded in these new sectors, especially the new sectors that will be dealing with the Green New Deal.
Yeah, and as we come towards the COP later on in this year, I suppose a lot of discussion that's going to take place around the question of climate and climate jobs and transition and all these kinds of things is going to intensify. So, I mean, it seems to me that they're trying to develop a platform that can, at least in some way, even if it's rhetorically, address some of these issues. I mean, I keep coming back to the point, Craig, something that we've covered on a podcast previously, that it's striking that while you have these kinds of words that come from the Scottish Government, at the very same time our natural assets have been sold off to international investors. And how you can cohere a kind of national plan around green energy and green jobs while you've sold all that off, to me is a huge problem. I mean, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Again, we're seeing a business strategy that seems to be based around foreign direct investment rather than building up a solid foundational domestic industry, which is something that Common Weal advocates. We have papers like our paper on an investment-led economy, which then got embedded into our plans for a resilient recovery from the pandemic. If you don't have the basis to build these wind turbines or whatever you're building, then you are just restricted and buying them in from the lowest bidder, which isn't really helping our economy as much as it could do. We're seeing other things like there was a really good promise there around buses. We are now in a Scotland that is going to renationalise the the trains, although recent news from the UK government and its attempts to fold the entire train network into a Great British Rail company may or may not stymie that. The focus is starting to turn towards other public transport, and there was a promise there to make the majority of buses in Scotland fossil fuel free by 2023. That's quite a big task, even if what they mean by majority is 51%. I always look for the minimum possible ask when a politician makes me a promise. So even if we are looking at getting the majority of buses fossil free, one way of doing that really easily would be to have a national bus company and a national procurement strategy to get these electric buses or hydrogen buses or whatever we want to use to replace them. We don't have that in Scotland. What we have is a network of private operators who ultimately will do what private companies do. So unless there's going to be legislation just to make fossil fuel buses illegal, how are we going to encourage these private companies to transition to fossil fuel buses? And I hope it doesn't mean throw them a bunch of taxpayers' money, throw them a bunch of subsidies and hope that they do it.
Yeah, very much so. Well, let's come on to what is probably the most interesting part of the speech that was made around the first 100 days. Included, I thought quite emphatically included, what sounds like pretty advanced discussions between the SNP and the Greens, up into and including, though of course this is all subject to discussion and may not happen, and all the rest of the caveats, but the fact that Nicola Sturgeon did even go as far as stating the potential of there being Green ministers involved in the government through structured talks involving the civil service to create, whether it's a coalition or some kind of more formal agreement that goes beyond confidence in supply, or if it's something less than that. Certainly it's an interesting development. The response to it has been, as you would imagine with these things, has been mixed. Some people very excited by the prospect, others slightly more wary about what the Greens might actually get out of it in the long run. But nevertheless, a very substantial development in Scottish politics. So before we get into the kind of detail of what all of these issues might raise in terms of policy, I wonder if you could just, for our listeners, just take us through a little bit of the mechanics of these kinds of discussions.
Yeah, so in the last Parliament, we had a situation where the SNP had a minority government, but they were in a situation where if the entire rest of the Parliament voted against the SNP on something, then the opposition would have the majority of the votes. So any bill that that the government brought forward that the opposition sufficiently disliked, it could be blocked. So that the SNP were always in the position of having to get the support of at least one other party, or at least a few rebels, to get their bills through. To me, I quite like that situation because it does force discussion and cooperation on bills rather than just getting your party whip to cajole your backbenchers into loyalty. We had a much more finely balanced Parliament this time. We had a situation where we had basically it came down to who was chosen as presiding officer. In the Scottish Parliament, the presiding officer, the person who maintains discipline in the chamber, is drawn from the MSPs. Whoever is elected from the Parliament to become the presiding officer has to give up their party affiliation, effectively ending their political career. And they become completely politically neutral, and they sit in front of the chamber. They still have a vote in bills, but by convention, they only vote if it would be a tie, and they only vote in a direction that prolongs the debate. So if the bill is at an early stage, so stage one of the three stages that a bill could go through, in a tied vote, the presiding officer would vote for the bill because that would progress the bill to stage 2 and allow it to be debated further. However, if the bill was at the final stage, where it's ready to be ratified by the Parliament, and if there was a tie, then the presiding officer would vote against the bill, causing the bill to fall, which would mean that the bill would have to be started again and brought back to Parliament from stage one, thus prolonging the debate. There would be no majority in the Parliament for the bill to pass, so the presiding officer would vote for it to not pass. The way things worked out, if the presiding officer had been chosen from the SNP, the balance of Parliament would have been 63 SNP MSPs and 65 others, meaning, again, we'd be in that situation where the SNP could be voted against in any bill by the opposition. However, if the presiding officer was chosen from the opposition, any of the opposition parties, the balance of the Parliament would have been 64-64, meaning that if it was SNP versus everybody else, the bill would be tied, and if it was at the final stage, the presiding officer would have to vote against it for it to fall, or at least to prolong the debate. This does tip the scales slightly in the advantage of the SNP. So it's an interesting situation we're in. I think we could see quite a few tied bills this Parliament, depending how things go. But this is potentially why the SNP have approached the Greens for a closer arrangement, because as things were, the presiding officer was chosen from an opposition party, actually chosen from the Greens. The now former Green MSP Alison Johnson is the presiding officer. So maybe by getting a formal coalition or a formal cooperation agreement, the SNP can essentially bank those Green votes and know that they have a working majority for their bills. However, it will now mean that there may be intense negotiation between the SNP and the Greens on any particular bill, especially if it's on something that the Greens maybe aren't so much in favour of.
So just a last kind of technical question, because I think it's something that comes up quite a lot when you have these kinds of discussions. Is there a difference, or rather, what is the difference between a formal cooperation agreement and a coalition?
Right, so yes, there's sliding scales of how closely you are cooperating. At the outer edges, you have what's known as a confidence and supply agreement, which means that in this case, the Greens would promise to vote for budgets and would vote for bills of no confidence to support the government, to allow the government to continue, but they wouldn't be bound to vote for the SNP on anything else, so they could happily vote against something they don't like. In a formal coalition, the SNP and Greens essentially become one party within the government. They promise, they fall under the same whip. They promise to vote with each other on everything. And in this case, the Greens would also expect to have ministers in the government working as the government, either at junior ministerial level or even at cabinet secretary level. And you would expect the number that they would get to be proportional to the relative size of the two parties, plus or minus whatever they can get out of negotiations. Now, the Greens don't seem to be pushing quite for a formal coalition. I should say, by the way, just for disclosure, I am a member of the Greens, although I'm not involved in any way in these decisions, and I'm not privy to anything that's going on within the party in any sort of official level. I'm just a member looking on from the outside on this. But my impression is that they don't seem to be going for a full formal coalition. They might be going for just something a little less than that. More than a confidence and supply, less than a formal coalition. They're calling it some sort of cooperation agreement. What this could mean is there could still be a Green minister, or maybe more than one. We don't know yet. We'll see how those negotiations happen over the next couple of weeks. We don't know what they'll be doing either, what portfolio they'll have. It does look like there will be somewhat more of an expectation of the Greens supporting the government, but there might be some sort of red line issues that they wouldn't be bound to vote for. This is all kind of speculative, though. We will have to watch these negotiations as they develop. And that's, of course, if an agreement comes to pass, and if the agreement is ratified by both parties. This was something the First Minister said, that both parties will have to follow their internal ratification processes to agree whatever deal comes out. And I expect within the Green Party that means that the Green members will have a vote on whether or not to accept any deal that comes out of it. So yeah, very speculative at the moment. But we will see over the next couple of weeks, and we'll maybe come back on the podcast once we have the details to explain what it actually means, and we'll have a better idea of what each of the parties potentially gain or potentially lose out of it.
I think it's one of those ones where there's possible short-term gain. From the perspective of the Greens, they may get a number of policies taken on board by central government. They may achieve some ministerial position, or as you say, maybe more than one, and that may elevate the party's standing and the party's perspectives when it comes to just even being known by the electorate. People forget that unlike you and I, Craig, who are every day in Scottish politics, most people are not. So there's that sort of potential. But then there's also potential pitfalls and risks as well associated with it, because the longer-term trajectory, rather than pulling the SNP to the left, could in fact see that the SNP have simply incorporated a lot of the Green rhetoric, which we know that the SNP are very good at. But I have to say, just before we move on, I was quite struck by the First Minister's statement on the issue in the Parliament, because it did seem to me to be very ambitious. So I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with something approaching the upper tier of agreements that are possible between the two parties, and that would be both interesting and also change some of the dynamics in the Parliament, and it'd be, as I say, quite fascinating to see how that develops.
Yeah, and it is interesting, looking around the world and seeing where green politics are starting to rise up in this era of, ever more intense climate emergency. The model that I think Nicola Sturgeon is kind of basing things on is New Zealand, where the government there actually won a majority, but despite that, still brought the Greens into government. To try and help them with their plans for addressing the climate emergency. We also have countries like Germany, where they're having the federal elections in September, and for various reasons, not least because Angela Merkel is retiring, and Germany is losing that very well-known bulwark of politics who has been there for years, and that's going to cause a massive realignment in German politics. The Greens right now are actually polling in first place in Germany, so we could see a Green-led government in Europe in the coming months. So it's an exciting time for people around the world who are interested in green politics.
Well, we could probably devote a whole podcast towards looking at these issues, because of course, the Greens in Ireland, as someone who's very much on the left of politics, you'd have to say, haven't exactly operated in a manner which, in my view anyway, progresses the left. And equally, in Germany, the German Greens are not so like the Scottish Greens when it comes to their political orientation. It's quite interesting you mention New Zealand, though, because the Scottish Greens press release also made mention specifically of the kind of New Zealand model. So maybe that's something that both parties are beginning to warm towards. I was going to ask as well, Craig, because we can't have this discussion without talking about independence. And I think it's no surprise to people who listen to this podcast that I've been quite pessimistic or quite critical, I suppose, of the independence strategy over recent years. And I certainly don't feel that we're in a position when it comes to policy around borders, the EU, or currency, or any of these big questions. And of course, I think that's detrimental, because we really should have these kinds of things in place and be ready to move forward. Now, I wanted to put this to you and get your general assessment of where you think we are. I noticed a slight change in language, and you can go too far into this, right? Because politicians and language, you can go on too obsessed with it, a level of sort of criminology. But through the election and running up to the election, it very much felt like, yes, after the COVID crisis has passed. But that was always, sort of added on to that, was always in the first half of this parliamentary term. I noticed in the 100 Days speech that it didn't mention the first half of this parliament, it just said this parliamentary term. So I think there's already movement around this and not in a direction that I would support. But I wondered what your general overview of where do you think we are when it comes to the reality of getting a referendum in this parliament?
I mean, in terms of electoral maths, we have the numbers in the parliament comparable to the numbers that were there in the 2011 parliament when the SNP had a majority government. Granted, it's now the SNP plus the Greens that really make up that majority. But there is that solid pro-independence majority in Parliament. If and when an indie ref bill comes towards Parliament, it will pass. I mean, they actually passed 2 in the last term, although never managed to progress them to an actual referendum. So that's really the thing. It's not really the maths now, it's the politics. Boris Johnson is adamant that there will not be another referendum. Now is not the time. We have to deal with the crisis and the aftermath of it before we can even think of it. There are people in the Tory government who go even further than that and have even said that they do not want to see another referendum until everybody who voted in the 2014 referendum has died of old age. And there are people in the Tory party who think even that's too soon. So this is a game not necessarily of maths and mandates, but of political will to push them through. This is something that we've been really campaigning on, is that we need to find ways of ramping up that pressure to make Westminster's acceptance of Scottish independence easier than continued resistance to it. Because that's really what will happen. To make independence happen, no matter the route we take, whether it's a sanctioned referendum or an unsanctioned referendum, or whatever route we end up taking to prove the democratic desire for independence, it will either need Westminster to sanction the move or to at least accept the results, and they will not do that if they think they can get away with it. So that pressure needs to be there. But you're right, also there needs to be that work. A lot of the promises of seeing a white paper come out of the SNP or the Scottish Government, as far back as 2019 now, there were promises of an independence white paper that would update the case for an independent Scotland. They simply haven't materialised. The 2018 Growth Commission was a disaster. Folk who are regular listeners to the podcast are probably sick of us saying that by now. The Social Justice Commission report that came out this week talked a lot about some of the attitudes that they wanted to take to independence, and some of the policies in there dealt with independence. Their chapter on immigration is actually really worth a read. I mean that sincerely, as is their chapter on pensions. But a lot of it was also either stuff that the Scottish Government was already doing, intended to do, or could do with the powers of devolution. So it laid out a proposition for an independent Scotland that wasn't even really pushing the boundaries of what is possible now. And I think we need to go further than that. So this is perhaps where folk like Common Weal come in. We are going to do that work. Back in 2018, we produced a book, How to Start a New Country, that took that period between an independence referendum and Independence Day and said, right, these are all the institutions Scotland needs to build to be a viable nation state in the 21st century. We were very careful in that book to try to keep policy out of it. We called it a future neutral approach. We said that if you followed this plan, you wouldn't automatically end up with a Common Weal vision of Scotland. You wouldn't automatically end up with an SNP vision of Scotland. But you could apply the SNP vision for an independent Scotland to that model. You could take a Tory manifesto for an independent Scotland and build it from where you would end up on Independence Day. And we think that's really important. You have to have that democratic choice. So we kept our personal vision of what a Common Weal independent Scotland would look like out of that book. The time is now to really present that. So we are going to go back through that book and we're going to pull together a lot of the work that we've done over the last several years, and we're going to pull together new work where the gaps exist, and we're going to start doing those work, that work on currency, on borders, on all the things that we think we need to have answered before we hit another referendum. So we will be talking about that over the coming months. I do encourage folk to check out our policy library and find all the stuff that we've already done, and really dive into that and find out what you like, and let us know what you think of it, and find out and let us know where you think the gaps are. What do you think needs to be updated or highlighted or brought to the fore, or has changed because the political landscape has changed?
Well, that seems like a very positive and useful place to end this week's podcast, Craig. Craig, who I do believe is one of the hardest workers for the independence cause when it comes to all things policy. So please do check out the policy library and have a look at the work that's already been done. As Craig said, there'll be lots to discuss over the coming weeks. Everything from what's going on in the Parliament around the SNP and the Greens to what's going on outside of the Parliament in the independence movement, and how we are moving forward, hopefully, towards a referendum on the national question. How long that will take, the obstacles that we face in terms of getting there, those are all things that we have to come to terms with and rise to. And with that, we'll be back with more discussion along all of those lines next week.